Excellent. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Sustainable Sportswear Equipment and Apparel Forum. We're putting on this forum, it's been staged by BASIS, which is the British Association for Sustainable Sport, in partnership with the UCA Business School for the Creative Industries, which includes the Centre for Sustainable Design. I'm Chris Whitaker. I'm chair of the management board at BASIS. And for those of you not aware of BASIS, we were founded 10 years ago by Russell Seymour, who's now our chief executive and who's here today and will be presenting a bit later. And our vision of BASIS really is about harnessing the power of sport to build a sustainable future. We genuinely believe sport can build a better future for us all. And our goal is to empower sport in the UK to be world leading in sustainability that will be driven by the urgency, which is dictated by the evidence that we see around us every day. So educating, sharing, and developing best practice, encouraging and facilitating collaboration amongst those interested and concerned about sustainability in sport, and influencing through sport, which is then acting as an advocate to represent the views of our members to government and to make sure that we're getting that message across. So those are some of our objectives. And very much staging events like these are part of that conversation with our members. And it's our determination to examine issues like this with them. I do want to thank a few people who have helped us put the forum together today and to make it a gathering of all parts of the industry to take on that challenge, not of why, but how we are going to reduce emissions massively and urgently to achieve net zero as soon as possible. And to do this, we're going to have to line up all the challenges and then tackle them one by one. Today is part of the conversation of asking how. So thank you to all our speakers. We've got Yassi Dadic, founder of Kahani, Mark Ivar Magnus, Vice President of the World Federation of Sporting Goods Industry, Guido Battaglia, Euro 2020, Head of Policy and Outreach, Centre for Sport and Human Rights, and Dr. Russell Seymour, CEO of BASIS. And also my co-organisers, Professor Martin Charter, the Director of the Centre for Sustainable Design, and Professor Philip Powell, Director of the Business School for the Creative Industry. Sorry, if everybody could mute themselves, please. Thank you. I also want to thank all of you, our delegates, for attending and being prepared to share your knowledge and experience with us later on in the breakout rooms. And to our researcher, Matthew Weatherfield, and who's done an amazing amount of deep diving for us into the different products, which we'll discuss a bit more further in the day. And to our event coordinator for today, Anna Beaton, many thanks. Okay, I will see you all during the morning at different times, but just a couple of housekeeping items. Please feel free to jump off to refuel at any time. And I'll now hand over to Professor Philip Powell from the Business School for Creative Industries.
Wonderful, thank you very much. I'm afraid, thanks to a missed train connection, I'm still in transit, and whoever said it's better to travel than to arrive, I think was not correct today. But welcome everybody. I'm delighted that UCA can be part of this incredibly important mission. UCA has a long tradition in the arts and the creative industries, but about 3 years ago, it decided that it wanted to use the skills that it had developed in creativity, in innovation, and try to help applying those to business practices to start the UK's only business school, which is focused on the creative industries. it brings the sorts of issues around creativity and innovation to the fore to try to find new solutions to the major wicked problems that the world faces. And clearly one of those problems is sustainability. So we are delighted to be part of this initiative. And we've had a presence in the sustainability research area for a number of years through our centre, which Martin runs. And we hope we can leverage that more widely through the sorts of partnerships with the organisations represented today. So I will continue to participate mobilely until I get to my office. But thank you very much, and welcome everybody.
Thank you, Philip. Right, so to kick off the day, Martin is going to introduce the programme and then just talk about the flow of the morning. Thanks, Martin.
Great. Yeah, unmute, classic Zoom moment. So maybe I'll just first do the technology and see if I can share my screen. Always good to get the technology working first. So great. So thank you very much, Chris and Philip. And thanks very much, Chris, for this very good collaboration and partnership that we're now in our sort of third iteration of events and looking to the future. So great experience and looking forward to doing more things into the future. So so essentially we have a number of presentations to start off with. So I'm going to give a bit of an overview of issues particularly related to cricket equipment, apparel and clothing. We're not focusing on venues today. That's another issue. If people are interested in issues around venues, BASIS does have an interest in that area, but we're focusing on the sort of, let's call it the product issues and supply chain issues. So I'm going to give a bit of an overview. Then we're going to have Mike Ivor, who will talk about their experience from the World Sporting Goods Federation, particularly bringing out their experience of looking at these sorts of issues in football. And then Guido will be then exploring some of the issues, social issues, particularly around supply chain. We'll then have a short panel, and then we'll move into breakouts for further discussion. Then there'll be a short report back and discussion, and then we'll close by 1 o'clock latest. And we'll be flexible, if we may close a bit earlier, but it's a hard line at 1 o'clock. So anyway, so I think without further ado, let's get into the meat of it. And so what I'm going to present a little bit is an overview of issues, as I mentioned, and the other thing that I should mention, I think, is that please, as things crop up, please post questions or thoughts into the chat box, and one of our colleagues, Anna, will be monitoring that we can bring in at the panel discussion or later on at the discussion stage. So don't be frightened or nervous of putting anything in the chat, but please just, issues, crop up, thoughts, questions, please put it in there. So cricket equipment, clothing and apparel. In our, initial research into this area, we're probably starting to feel it's probably one of the most, let's say, gear-intensive sports. To play that game, there is a lot of equipment that you need, or you have the option to need. So we reckon there's about 40 combinations and permutations of equipment, apparel that you might use. These are the variations on this, but there's a lot of equipment once you start to, as we did, try and break it all down. And from a sustainability, so basically, it's a big, in terms of equipment use and units used in the game from village to test, there's probably a lot more kit or units sold and used than you perhaps would think. So from a sustainability perspective, it's quite useful to frame this in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. We have the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that were part of a recalibration of the Sustainable Development Agenda by the UN in December 2015. And this is a useful framework to start to look at how sustainability issues might impact on cricket equipment. So the 17 goals are split into environmental, social and economic, and we can sort of start to think about, how those impact on different types of equipment. And just some work that myself and Yashi, who's on the call, did, we started to try and break down, and this is really a first cut, some of the key issues, that might relate to the different goals. So, just for the purposes of this presentation, I'll just take, a pair of trousers, that male or female will wear in the game. And just sort of what are some of the environmental issues? Well, particularly when we look at the SDG around water, we've got issues in the supply chain to do with dyes, chemicals, potential water pollution. We've got issues with clothing at the end of life in terms of landfill, in sort of city community areas, in urban areas. We've got issues around, in terms of consumption and production, issues around not just the buying of the products, but reuse, materials, recycling of clothing at the end of life. We've got the whole emissions associated with manufacturing the clothing, but also that embedded carbon as it's transported around the world to be used, wherever the game is played. We've also, to do with particularly polyester trousers and other polymeric-based clothing. We've got growing issues around microplastics and various changes that are happening there. If we look at the social side, what we are finding is a lot of the manufacturing is in South and Southeast Asia, and there are issues there, that have not really been explored in terms of how production happens. Are the people, workers, do they receive health insurance? Are there, a lot of, particularly in the clothing manufacturing side, will be women, issues to do with equality, et cetera, et cetera. And again, if we think about the economic part, a lot of the sector manufacturing is outside UK, in India, Pakistan, and even wider. So there are issues there in terms of pay, work practices, etc., and just the issues around how the factories operate, for example. So that's the sort of frame. So even just booking out trousers there, we can start to pick up. There's a set of issues that we wouldn't have necessarily thought about. And Russ will be talking about this later, but this is an excellent in-depth piece of research with a number of scientists that BASIS completed looking at the impact of climate change on cricket. And I won't go into any detail other than say one of the findings and speculations into the future, if we do continue to see growing temperature rises, particularly in the global south, there's going to have to redesign helmets and clothing to increase ventilation, because people just may collapse. You're going to play the game, you've got to be ventilated in that sense. So, some very practical issues associated with, from the high level down to very practical, points. And particularly also, on a very pragmatic level, bamboo fibers absorb sweat. So there's some very pragmatic detail points there. So some of the, so if we, start to look at alternative fibers for clothing, that's, and sorry, it's actually not bamboo fiber. They may be able to absorb sweat, but the fiber that actually is very, there's probably a scientific name for this, sweat absorbent, is actual fibers from coffee grounds. And there are coffee fibers being produced from coffee grounds in a company called Syntex in Taiwan, for example. So some of the issues, if we're even stepping away from climate change and circular economy, is the appetite of the sector for innovation. We have seen innovation in the sector, and we're at a particular point in time where next week we have the launch of the 100 in one shape or another, and the ECB is very committed to this. So this is a very, we're slightly tearing the rule book up as we did with, I'm sort of pejoratively, in 2003, 2004 with 2020. So there's another sort of phase of change coming to the sector. We've also got, as an ex sort of player at sort of league cricket level, now retired, I haven't bought a bat for a long time, but I was shocked to see the costs, of bats, maybe up to like £400 or £500. So for access and social inclusivity, there's an issue about, price of equipment and gear. There's also, in terms of anything to do with the kit, the first thing is a performance. It has to perform, and we'll touch on a number of those issues. And also there's sort of balance between the tradition in the game and the innovation, and that ongoing battle, between Test cricket and let's call it T5. So we're going to have, this, challenges going on. And already we're seeing that tradition impacted. This is a couple of studies by the Heritage Craft Association that effectively say that hand-stitched cricket balls are extinct in the UK. There is no longer any production of hand-stitched cricket balls in the UK. We believe there's some finishing, but there is no production of hand-stitched cricket balls. Also, in terms of bats, this organisation reviews what they term craft-based products every year or two, and they evaluate them. And they're saying that, cricket bat manufacturing in the UK is on the endangered list. 10 to 20 manufacturers left in the UK. But what we also have is that split between the very small bespoke producers of cricket bats. We've got the sort of medium-sized producers, the Grays Nichols, the Kookaburras, etc., etc., and then the movement of the transnationals into the sector, the Pumas, the Adidas, the Nike. So so in terms of that UK base, and there are problems there with skills in the bat making. I spoke to one of the Hunt's cricket bats. I had a very excellent conversation there, but the guy said himself he's 72 or something, and I said, could you join the webinar? And he said, sorry, I don't really know what a webinar is. And I said, could you get somebody younger in your organization to join? And he said the next youngest person is 68. So we've got issues to do with the skills of making the equipment, and if we're not careful, some of those skills may die out. So there's a bit broader issue here, strategic issue, about what we could do in UK to retain and develop the cricket equipment sector. And what we see also is new technology coming in. So on the one hand, we've got very, technologies and skills going back into the sort of 17th, 8th, century. But now we've got new technologies moving in. This is a product that Anil Kumbli has developed that is using Centra and AI technology to monitor performance. And so that's performance of the player, but also it's broader in terms of the wider audience in terms of stats and stuff. So you've got new technology moving in. The international guys have that, the pedal, they have this strapped to their back, monitoring the mileage they do, etc., etc. So we got this tradition versus innovation, and what could we do in the UK as well to build or retain a sector, particularly thinking about circularity as well, and I'll come back to that. So of course, the game is governed by the laws of the game, the laws of cricket, and essentially that are managed by the relevant committee within the MCC. And the most relevant laws that affect equipment that we have seen, particularly are law 4 on the ball and law 5 on the bat. And those laws have been tested over the years in terms of innovation that has happened. But also in starting to think about, the framework that the equipment sits within, wearing various other hats. I'm quite involved in standardization stuff. So we found, here there's the law 4 of the game, which specifies the weight and circumference, etc., of the cricket ball. But also, I wasn't aware of this, there's a British standard for the making of cricket balls. What is still, as we get into this sector, that really has not been researched in great detail, we have found. There's a lot of research in performance, community benefits of cricket, but in terms of the depth on the products, sustainability, very little. So we're undertaking research. So I assume that there is still cricket ball manufacturing of some form in the UK. Obviously not hand-stitched cricket balls, but we've got all these different variations of the products and equipment used in the sector. And that's another thing we're interested to find out, what still is, what elements of the sector is still in the UK and what isn't. In cricket bats, there is no British standards on cricket bats. This is what we found, quite surprisingly, that others may have other more information on this, but there's a law 5 that specify, the width, depth, and indeed, I think I picked up also subsequent to this, there's been a change where some of the depth of the bat can only be has been a certain length because of the growth of the big bats. And I didn't know this. I know the umpires in the international games had a ball, thing they place the ball through, but they also supposed to have a thing they put the bat through now if they see a big bat, apparently, so you typically have a weighting of bats, and those change over the years. You get trends and issues around that movement to the heavy bat back to the light back, and different at a sort of professional level, what suits. But it was also, I guess, one of the key things that's become quite relevant recently is that in 1979, with the use of the aluminium cricket bat, Conco, that Dennis Lilly famously brought onto it was a test. I think it was a test, an England-Australia test match. The laws of the game were changed to specify that cricket bats could only be made out of wood. And I'll come back into why that's sort of interesting as well. What we've also found is there's our British standards around head protectors, face protectors. So there's a lot of more, in thinking about it, one should be surprised about it. The standards are really around the protective equipment, so boxes, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where there's more of a number of standards. But there's also some sort of perverse, let's call it, codes and laws that are still a little bit unclear. Grace Nichols did a lot of innovation to produce a series of products and gloves and I believe other equipment using recycled and upcycled materials. And Sam Billings used this in a 2020 game in New Zealand, and effectively, due to some sort of obscure color rated regulation to do with broadcasting, to do with the number of colors that can be in a sense visualized in equipment, those gloves and the other equipment had to be withdrawn. So Grace Nichols, as far as we understood, did a lot of innovation around thinking about upcycled gloves. So the offcuts were essentially, as it says, they were offcuts from the manufacturing process. They reutilized that production offcuts into gloves and other, but effectively it was banned. So there's a sort of slightly perverse restriction to, let's call it, sustainable innovation. So in terms of cricket bats, still the predominant material is English willow, and which has grown. And I see, if I get this wrong, Jeremy, please correct me in the chat. Primarily still grown where it's grown in the UK and the southeast, but from very helpful information that Jeremy provided me, there is willow grown in Europe along the Danube, in Romania, but also there is Kashmiri willow in India, and I picked up there is some plantations of willow in states, a few states in Australia, that were actually initiated by Slazenger some time ago. So there are pockets of willow out there that are used, but it, like any natural material, it's subject to the natural laws and climate change, and there isn't a finite supply, of the wood essentially. And of course, those the wood goes into the bats, of which there are multiple varieties if you're including the transnationals, and most a significant proportion of those bats, if you're thinking of the global market, are out based on outsourced production. But it's still a heavy craft-based industry there, with a lot of skills in making the bats, and a lot of professionals and semi-professionals will. They'll go and talk to their bat maker, get the right weight, the right feel. So there's also that relationship there. And over the years, there's been various innovations, where bat manufacturers have sort of played around with the sort of mass of the bat with the scoop. And I always fondly remember age 17 getting a scoop as a Christmas bat, as a Christmas present, which I remember that as a great moment to get that. And then, so taking, material out of the back of the bat, redistributing it. Then you had, the jumbo and the turbo, again, where they, Stuart Surrey's redistributed material. And then with the advent of 2020, I'm just picking out a couple of the innovations. So you've got shoulderless bats, all sorts of other things. But at the advent of 2020, there were various innovations, the mongoose bat and a couple of others that, again, still, fulfilled, were within the laws of the game, but, look very different, but seem to sort of disappear fairly quickly. But here, this picture, I think, shows really quite from Barry, I think that's Barry Richards, ex-South Africa and Hampshire. Anyway, so just showing the difference of the big bats, the David Warner bat compared to the old style, bats, just the amount of wood, light pressing of the bat, and where in the past maybe a lot of people would keep their bat going for a long time. A lot of the pros they only have a finite number of lives associated with the product. We call it back before it breaks. But as I said, we've had innovations, new materials used, like the attempt to use aluminium. There's plastic or polymers are being used in various bats for kids cricket, for quick cricket, and ECB have been heavily involved in the whole area of taking the game out to kids. And also very recently, we've had the Darcel, who was on the call, and his colleagues at Cambridge have developed the bamboo cricket bats that used one type of the many types of bamboo out there to produce a prototype that's got a significant amount of interest. And as we understand it, one of the issues there was that within the laws of the game, as I mentioned earlier, we have that bats could only be made of wood, and bamboo is a grass. So there is, discussion going on around the materials. It's sparking another conversation there. So, and just to illustrate, just the reality of the global supply chain here, this is a guy called Joe Sillett, who in the early 2000s developed the Woodworm cricket brand. And I was there in a game where he scored his century at Brook Cricket Club in Surrey,
where he had a bat that had woodworm in, and he got his 100, and his father had just got a payout pension fund, and they set up a company with the woodworm cricket brand that then Peterson and Flintoff used, and it grew quite significantly. But even him, as a small company in Sussex, he outsourced his production to Indonesia, to Taiwan, to India, and China even. So he was outsourcing and not producing in the UK, mainly because of the labour costs. And what we're seeing is some, elements to do with the sort of perverse aspects of supply chains, where, parts of the items of bats and balls are sent to India to be produced, and then they're sent back to the UK to be finished. And there seems to be some evidence that materials can also be shipped out to parts of, to India, where they're assembled because of lower labour costs, and then shipped back. So there's definitely issues to do with global supply chains there. And also, what we found is that there's actually, perhaps more of a unrecognised sector around the whole repair and refurbishment of cricket bats. And going online and doing the research for this project, there is now quite a significant number of videos showing you how to repair your bats, and even a very interesting sort of like, I think it's about 3-4 years old, a company called Fantail in New Zealand, who effectively they produce customized bats, but also they have a repair service, which they charge various types of repair. And also they've got a refurbished bat, fully refurbished bat, which they call a revamped bat. But also interestingly with this company, they have sort of very high quality videos showing you how to do this, but they're acknowledging sustainability in their mission statement. Based in New Zealand, they want to have a positive impact, as a lot of the millennials do. They want a good business, but sustainability is the heart of it. So they're also recognizing and looking for new solutions with new sorts of materials, recycled materials, etc. Clothing and apparel. So again, a lot of, if you look at a game, one game, there could be maybe over 100 items of clothing used. So that you start to stack the numbers up. This is quite a significant industry. And what we have is a lot of outsourced manufacturing. We've got issues maybe to do with wages, what is paid in the supply chain, working conditions, factories, health, worker safety, diversity, as we mentioned earlier. And again, a classic polyester trousers, it isn't just those issues in production. We've got these wider issues. If you're washing your trousers, that can be producing microplastics. That's becoming a broader issue. So there is a sort of these obscure almost links there. But what we're starting to see, for example, in other areas is the emergence of the use of other sorts of fibers. And so we've got a company called Pinatex who's producing fibers from pineapple. We've got another company called Bananatex using fibers from banana, and then bamboo fibers. Indeed, Warwickshire last year launched a new range where they were using shirts that incorporated bamboo fibers. I mean, there may be other examples out there, and we'd be really interested to hear about that. If people do have thoughts and ideas, please just send those on to us, because we're just trying to collect what's going on at the moment. But also you have other types of fibers that could be used. So this is a fiber that's being used, that's a second life fiber, nylon fiber, that is from waste fishing nets. And the waste fishing nylon nets are and repolymerized and then produced into a second life fiber that's been used in clothing. And I just Googled there are examples of caps, for example, for other sectors that are using the eco fiber. We've also got the emergence of, in this, I term this fourth green consumer wave, of the emergence of vegan leathers. And this was just, lab stuff a couple of years ago, but now it's starting to be commercialized.
pluses and minuses with these vegan leathers, in the sense, they're, and also there are a number of high-profile vegans in cricket, is that, yes, they're not using animal hides, but they're still using a polymer as a binder. So there are still, issues there. But the interesting point now, Nike have just launched with Pt1 a vegan leather shoe just a few years ago. Oh, sorry, a few weeks ago even. So this is, things are bubbling up. New innovations are bubbling up that maybe this sector could, it's worth considering. So going forward, maybe we need to start to think about, how we move from the sort of linear approach with the cricket equipment, where it's sourced, it's processed, it's used, it ends up in landfill, to a more circular approach. And and there are approaches to do this, to start to think through, choice of materials, designing for repairability, et cetera, and we'll be looking to explore this in another workshop in October and November. So if anybody wants to be interested in attending that, please let us know, and we'll add you to the list. So just in moving towards the end, my colleague Matt will just give a little bit more detail quickly on a little bit more research we found on bats and balls. So Matt, over to you, and I will move your slides. So please just tell me to move slide or whatever.
That's great. Thank you very much, Martin. First of all, I must apologise for the less than stellar image you're getting on the end of this. I had my laptop fully up, and then my Zoom suddenly decided it didn't want to work anymore. So I've quickly put it up on my phone, and we'll go from there. So firstly, what I've been doing with Martin is I've been going through a list of the different types of cricket equipment and looking at not only the material composition involved with them and sustainability issues around that, but then also the potential pathways for innovation of how can we improve on the current materials that are being used, and are the present alternatives appropriate enough. So if we go on to the first slide proper, then we look at cricket balls, and there are two key parts to cricket balls, as many of you will probably know. You've got the core and you've got the casing. Now, they've been chosen because of their ductile properties. So for the core, it's made from compressed cork bark, and that's because it maintains its shape well, and it's a really quite good material to absorb any of the pressure that balls will face. It's the same thing with the yarn, really, and so you see the habit of these lightweight materials that have been chosen for a purpose, because there's both strong and lightweight, and that's something that we will be looking for in substitute materials. So that's what we want to try and do, maintain the best parts of original materials that are being used and find the most appropriate alternatives. Now, alongside, for the casing, you have the yarn quilted inside leather, which is made from animal hide, and it's with proteins. It's tanned with proteins and aluminium salts to give it durability, and that's key to a lot of these processes, so that they're hardy enough to be used over and over and have that sort of durability that is needed in professional sports. If we go to the next slide, then we can see potential pathways for innovation. Now, the key concerns over the leather is more sort of social sustainability and moral issues over that, and concerns over use of animal hides. Now, in terms of wider sustainability, obviously, animal farming has its environmental drawbacks due by sort of the CO2 emissions from farming processes. However, obviously, the level would be almost side product of that. But there have been many advancements in vegan leather, such that Martin extended on already, such as alternatives from pineapple leaves and cactus leaves, and that's shown that there really is an alternative that can be both sustainable and keep in touch with sort of moving moral feelings towards animal products. Now, in terms of the cork, whilst cork is a really good product to be using, there are this, even though it is a sustainable product in itself, as it absorbs up to 3 times more CO2 once the bark has been harvested, so it's actually more sustainable as a result of cricket ball manufacture. Its main drawbacks in terms of sustainability come from supply side issues and the fact that it takes nearly 30 years for it to mature ready for harvesting, and you could have and alternatives like bamboo fibres have been suggested as a quicker growing alternative that could be equally durable. And if you increase supply, then you can make sure that you meet up with current demand, and you are more able. It's better for supply, if I just put it like that. If we go on to the next slide, with cricket bats, you've got the main cleft made from cricket bat willow, and this faces similar issues to cork in a way, as there are supply side issues, especially due to the fact it takes 15 years for the trees to mature and 25% of the harvest is generally unusable. And bamboo has been suggested as an alternative that could be more appropriate for developing cricket nations such as China, because it matures within a third of the time. It allows for multiple harvests over one cycle, and it's a generally cheaper material that is also more absorbent of carbon. You also have sugarcane, which comes from Malaysia and from Indonesia, and that is used in the handle, whether it's spliced with rubber for shock absorbance. If we go on to the final slide, then we sort of are confronted with one of the main innovations that Martin has really been talking about, which is the potential for a bamboo bat. Now, a prototype has been developed by researchers at the University of Cambridge, and it's using for the main cleft of the bat laminated bamboo, which is a product which maintains the performance qualities of willow whilst having improved sustainability features. It's not only got a quicker manufacturing process and is as strong, but it's also got improved performance capabilities such as a larger sweet spot, which means shots could be up to, say, 20% bouncier. And that's a really key thing we want to look at continuing this research. How can we combine both sustainability and innovation to improve the performance of the sport as a whole? Because there will be many issues around tradition and around performance in terms of how sustainability may affect sport and worries that you're trying to cram it in there. But if you can show that you can actually make it so that the sport is more exciting and that it goes hand in hand with performance and the next level advancement we would see anyway, then I think that's a really key way and key line on which innovation can be pursued. Now, simply one of the main steps for this pathway of innovation to continue is weight reduction, as it is a heavier bat, 40% at the moment, but it is only a prototype, and it just gives us a key direction for where such innovation needs to go next. And it shows that with bamboo being identified as a key product and a more sustainable alternative, it shows that there's really a lot that can be done, and we will be continuing this analysis alongside of the full range of cricket clothing as well, and we hope to have those results shortly. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Matt. I mean, sorry we're running a little bit over, but Matt's been doing this excellent research, and we thought we'd find a space to put this in the session. So just to clarify very briefly before I close this, I mean, we're looking at being a platform for innovation. We're not looking at producing stuff ourselves. So we're looking at supporting stakeholders in the sector where we can, whatever knowledge we have and connections, to look at innovation in terms of sustainability. So and we'll be announcing later on in the year some ideas that we have around that area. So clearly it's an interesting point in time with the pandemic, how things have changed, the ongoing discussion over test crickets, not just the Blast in the UK and the other tournaments, the IPL, but also the sort of the issue about bringing in new audiences, making the game, relevant. So one area that we are contemplating and thinking about and have had some interest, at least at a conceptual level, is why don't we make the 100 in 2020 sustainable? And what would that even mean? So we're just leaving that as a thought, and I will shut up now and I will pass back to Chris.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you to Matthew. That was a really great way to frame probably the conversation for the rest of the day. So our next speaker is Dr. Russell Seymour, who, as I said, is the Chief Executive of BASIS. And he's going to have a look at climate change and cricket gear. Russell?
Yep, thanks a lot, Chris. Thanks for the introduction. I'll just share my screen. So I'm going to try and do a whiz through lots of issues around primarily climate change, but a couple of other sustainability issues that's linked to cricket gear, clothing and apparel. So very quick introduction to BASIS. I'll give a quick look at a definition of sustainability of cricket, equipment and clothing regulations. Martin's already covered those a little bit, but I'll talk a wee bit more on that. Some recommendations, and I've also been asked to talk about Sport 2050, which some of you may have seen. The BBC did a series on their BBC Sport website around what sport might look like in 2050. So I just pulled some of the points from the cricket story that was there that I think is relevant to us. So very briefly, BASIS, our position is that sport happens and it will continue to happen. And although sport has an impact on the environment, we're also impacted by the environment and environmental change and all of these sustainability issues that we've talked about. But in general, sport is positive, all the social benefits, all the economic benefits that it brings. So the position that we take as BASIS is that we just need to find a position where we can balance any negative environmental impacts against all of the positive impacts that we can have. So essentially, we're managing the sport that is already happening. We're not necessarily about using sport as a platform to talk about or promote sustainability issues, although we do that as part of the discussion of the way we manage things. But we just want to make sure or try to assist sport in being much more sustainable, because sport can actually talk about these issues in a trusted way. There's no political agenda around sport doing this. We do webinars, we do conferences, etc., but we also produce reports. And you've already seen Martin pulled up the image of Hit for Six, but the Game Changer report was produced back in 2018, talking about sports more generally, the impact of climate change. Hit for Six talks specifically about cricket, but just a few weeks ago we published Rings of Fire, which is looking at how heat could impact athletes at the Tokyo Olympics. A quick definition of sustainability. If you Google for a definition of sustainability, you'll find this one that's close to the top there. Our Common Future was a document that was produced back in the 80s. I think it was 87. It was published. It's also known as the Brundtland Report. The ex-Norwegian Prime Minister wrote the report, Gro Harlem Brundtland, and it's development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Many of you will have seen this definition before. There's something intuitive about it. It kind of makes sense, but I would argue that if you look at it in a bit more detail, you can question a few elements of it. Who defines what needs are? The needs of somebody in North America or Western Europe is probably very different to somebody in Southern Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa, for example. So there are debates and discussions, but intuitively, we kind of get what it means. We understand what it means. And it develops these three concepts of environmental protection, social equality, and economic growth. Now, I would prefer the language that's at the bottom there. I feel that the protection, equality, and growth actually implies something controlling. It's very political, very controlling. And it's a way of really strongly managing, whereas my preferred language was actually from a former British standard, which is no longer in use. The revised version of this British standard does use the Brundtland Report definition, but it talks about environmental responsibility, acting responsibly towards the environment. Social progress, this is positive, it's continuous, it's moving forward. Equality is almost something that you get to a minimum level and you can stop, whereas progress is continuous, it keeps us going. And economic activity doesn't necessarily imply continuous growth, which a lot of people talking about sustainability feels isn't sustainable in and of itself. But these three elements come together. I'm sure many of you have seen this image before. When these three come together, you've got a sustainable approach. But for basis, we even find using the term sustainability a little bit difficult. It can have different meanings. When you're talking about financial sustainability as opposed to economic sustainability, there are nuances that can be tricky. And it can be difficult to talk about this to people who maybe don't feel they have time, don't have the background, don't have the knowledge to discuss it. So we try and use a thread of health, a simple one hook of health. So this isn't a perfect correlation, but the way we try and talk about these now is to talk about personal health. So the physical and mental health and well-being of the people that come to you, use your products, use your venues. It's community health. This equates roughly to the economic sustainability. This is about your relationships. It's about your supply chains. It's meaningful relationships with your suppliers, with the communities around you, with other stakeholders. And then planetary health is about understanding and minimizing your impacts on natural systems. A little bit of science coming up. I'm not going to do too much detail, but back in 2017, there was a paper published called The World Scientist Warning to Humanity, a Second Notice. 25 years previously, a paper which was more theoretical, saying these are problems that might happen in the future, was published. So back in 1992. In 2017, they looked at some data from those warnings. So a few graphs, if they'll come up. So one thing they said was about the ozone hole. Those of you around back in the 80s will remember the ozone hole was the biggest problem at the time. Something called, the world leaders got together and they signed something called the Montreal Protocol, which banned these chemicals that were going up into the ozone layer and destroying the ozone, this protective layer that stops UV light. With this decline of chlorofluorocarbon production, the ozone hole started to recover. So this is a positive, and it demonstrates that when politicians get together, they can actually do something, they can actually take action. So this has got a green border around it because it's a positive story. If we look at freshwater resources from the 1960s coming up to the mid-2010s, that's not a positive story. There's a decline, so a red border. The rest I'm going to nip through quite quickly now, but it's the colors that are relevant. Green is good, red is bad. So marine catch is declining. Dead zones, these are literally areas of the oceans where there is no life, are increasing. Forest cover is reducing. Abundance of vertebrate animals reducing significantly. Carbon emissions going up, temperature change increasing, population levels for humans is increasing, as are the ruminant livestock that we rely on. So all these trends are going the wrong way. Another paper in 2019 looked at a lot more detail. Do not try and read these. It's just, there's too much there. But on the left, we've got some human impacts. On the right, we've got the climate response. Again, it's the colors that's important. So in terms of what people are doing, there are a few things there which are positive. Most of it's going the wrong way. In terms of the climate response, every single measure is going in the wrong direction. So it's pretty undeniable. There are huge impacts to what we're doing to the world, and we need to change that. And sport is no different. Every element of society is going to be impacted and is causing some of these issues. There are different ways of looking at this. This is the model on the right there. Again, don't look in too much detail at it, but this is something called the planetary boundaries model. There's just been there's a Netflix documentary and a book has just come out called Breaking Boundaries, which describes some of this in a more popular way rather than the scientific literature. But the ones that are most relevant, I think, to cricket gear and clothing is probably waste and then climate change. And we've got to find ways to mitigate what we're doing, so reduce our impacts now. But we're at a point where, as all of those trends demonstrate, these things are happening already. So we've also got to start to adapt as well. I'm just going to use a few examples to show how cricket is currently being impacted by these issues. So first one I'm going to talk about briefly is air quality. And you may hear some talk about things called PM10s and PM2.5s, and it just stands for particulate matter, bits, tiny bits in the air. So PM10s, things like dust, pollen, mold. But PM2.5 is combustion particles, different compounds in the air. And this just shows the size of them. These are tiny things, and PM2.5s can actually get into the lungs and pass into the bloodstream as well. So these are having significant effects, but we don't know exactly what those longer term effects might be. This is Delhi, India Gate on a very smoggy day. But when you try and play sport in those conditions, it becomes difficult. So this was December 2017, India versus Sri Lanka. And in the days before it was trendy to wear, or I should say necessary, not there were actually players on the pitch wearing face masks because the air quality was that bad. Players were being sick on the pitch. Bowlers were only able to bowl 2 overs at a time before they left the pitch to go onto oxygen to try and recover. There were oxygen cylinders on the side of the pitch up in the changing rooms. So it had a huge impact on this match in particular. But if you look at the Game Changer report that I mentioned briefly earlier, the opening line of the section on cricket says, of all the major pitch sports, cricket will be hardest hit by climate change. So what are these impacts actually going to be? I'm sure you'll recognize exactly what this is. Obviously, it's a picture of the Earth. But here, this is around the West Indies. So just to the north is North America, Central America, and Northern South America. And obviously, this is the West Indies in this general area, a great cricket playing country, or group of countries, I should say. 3 Category 5 hurricanes passing across that area all at the same time. This was 2017. And a 4th one actually came through as well. Hurricane Maria came through later, and had this impact on Windsor Park in Dominica, a test playing ground. So huge damage to the infrastructure. And similarly at the most recent Rugby World Cup, Super Typhoon Hagibis came through. 3 matches were cancelled, and bottom right there you can see the Canadian rugby team, who should have been playing a rugby match, were actually helping with the cleanup operations. But this had impacts for the organisation. Those 3 matches, there wasn't time to reschedule them, and some of them had implications for qualifying rounds. So administrators for sport may have to start looking at weather impacts and putting in more time for matches to be replayed. This is Corbridge Cricket Club up in Northumbria in the north of England. Just a lovely summer's afternoon, people out playing cricket. But this is what it looked like after Storm Desmond came through, again in 2017 from memory. The club had only recently managed to get enough money to build these facilities. The ECB stepped in and assisted, and some of the facilities were rebuilt. My understanding, and I know there are people from ECB on the call who possibly know better than I, my understanding around this time, ECB paid out around £1 million to assist clubs to recover from this sort of damage. It's doubled that now because this is now becoming more frequent. And it's relevant to cricket because, unlike rugby and football, the spectators that go to watch international cricket matches tend to play as well. So if we don't get people coming in and playing cricket, then maybe it's going to impact later on the people that actually come and watch international cricket. This is Worcestershire on a day when they should have actually been playing cricket. So some even professional clubs, first-class grounds, are actually being impacted by much more frequent flooding, and it has knock-on effects for things like insurance, etc. But just people actually able to come and play to recover from this. It isn't just that the water has to go, you then have to address all the issues with the pitch and cleaning up. The World Cup in 2019 with the final played at Lords. The first week of the Cricket World Cup in 2019, or first or second week, saw 3 match abandonments and 1 no result match. It was officially the wettest World Cup in Cricket World Cup history because of that disruption from those matches. But later in the tournament, 1 match at Lords was played in 34-degree heat. Now that's high for England, as we know. In 2016, the Indian Premier League there'd been a huge drought in India for 3-4 years, and yet cricket pitches were still being irrigated. Millions of litres of water were being poured on to generate these beautiful green lush pitches. 3 clubs were taken to court, and the courts ruled you can no longer irrigate your pitch. If you can't irrigate your pitch, you can't play cricket. So in the middle of the season, I think it was 17 matches had to be moved out of state, moved out of the area. So the disruption to the clubs, to the fans, to all the logistics that went with it was huge. So the biggest cricket league in the world, impacted by weather effects, made more common, made more frequent by climate change, made more severe by climate change. This is widespread. This is South Africa, Western Province Cricket Association in 2017 cancelled club and school cricket due to drought. The pitches just became too hard. It was too dangerous to play. So cricket was not played for a period, again, because of weather impacts. In 2019, Ireland played their first test match at Lord's. One of the days of that match was the hottest day ever recorded in England, 37.8 degrees centigrade. This isn't just an issue for the players, because on that day, I was working at Lord's at the time. On that day, we more than doubled the number of spectators that had to go for medical treatment because of heat and heat-related illness, heat-related issues. So there's a duty of care to spectators. Joe Root, this was the test match in Sydney in January 2018. He batted through the whole day. Outside of the ground, temperatures were recorded at 47 degrees centigrade. In the middle, where Joe Root was batting, the on-field peak was 57.6 degrees. 57.6 degrees. He batted the full day, 6 hours, wearing full pads. And that has a huge implication for you not being able to sweat, not being able to release that heat from you. Sweating is your natural way of removing heat. So if you can't sweat, you get all these physiological effects, and this comes from the Hit for Six report. Huge impacts on the body, going all the way up to heat stroke, which is a medical emergency and you need treatment for. And Joe Root did spend the night in hospital. Apparently he had a stomach bug as well, but he had to spend the night in hospital after batting. So the major factors that do limit or that impact in terms of heat, the environmental conditions, obviously the temperature, the humidity, how intensely you're exercising. And in fact, a batsman, a test match batsman, can be using as much energy as a marathon runner. It's just used in different ways, sudden bursts of energy for running between the wickets, but you use a lot more energy than people realize. But also the clothing worn, because the clothing effectively insulates and it provides a barrier so that heat can't be released. You can't release the sweat, it can't evaporate. But the sweat also goes into the fabric and it becomes heavier and it sticks to the body. So clothing is important in managing issues related to heat. So some of the potential implications, again, these are listed in the Hit for Six report. We could see more games postponed, rearranged to cooler times of day because of safety related heat stress. And some sports are introducing these heat stress indices. You know, we may see cricket in the future, not just postponed because of rain, but postponed because of heat. It'd be quite an odd feeling for England if we ever had to postpone due to heat. But poorer performance, just as you get hotter, as your body gets hotter, your brain just starts to shut down, your hand-eye coordination starts to reduce. So there could be poorer performance. Maybe that implies things for the spectators as well, if there are poorer games. Decreased motivation to perform. It's not that it's a conscious decision, but the body just can't perform in that high heat. So again, performance related. Increased likelihood of heat exhaustion, potentially batsmen retiring hurt, an increased likelihood of heat stroke requiring medical attention. And climate change really is becoming a massive factor for cricket. It has the potential to fundamentally alter the game. And cricket has always changed. All sports always change, they evolve. The way we play cricket now is different to the way we played in the 70s or the 50s or whatever. But climate change is something that is impacting cricket from the outside. So it's something that we have to adapt to. It's not something that there's innovation from within cricket. So it's something that we need to take seriously and look at. In terms of clothing and equipment, There's nothing in the laws that talks about clothing as such. The laws are about the way you play the game, not what you wear when you play the game. So nothing in the laws as such, but there are clothing and equipment regulations. So the ICC document is to the left, and the ECB have a similar document, effectively translating that for domestic. Primarily, this is about what advertising you can have on there and what colour things can be. It doesn't actually necessarily specify particular things about the fabrics or what fabrics should be used, etc. So there's not a huge amount of guidance in there, but it only ever talks about trousers, for example. It never talks about being allowed to wear shorts. And as Martin's already alluded to, there's a series of British standards around protective equipment. So I won't go into that in too much detail. The recommendations due to climate change, again, these come from the Hit for Six report, adjusting regulations to allow players to wear shorts. For example, there may be other reasons why shorts may not be appropriate, but for example, shorts or other non-standard clothing to increase cooling, the ability to evaporate the sweat, and review of fabrics to enhance evaporation and cooling, wicking sweat away, etc. And equipment, manufacturers should accelerate testing of helmets, gloves, pads that will enhance airflow to help reduce the major impact, which is going to be heat. Just briefly to talk about the Sport 2050, and worth taking a look if you've not seen this, but just Google BBC Sport 2050, and there's a whole series of imagined stories. Is it totally imagined? This is not a prediction of what we think is going to happen. I was one of the so-called experts that actually was on a panel to talk about these different stories. So completely imagined, but grounded in what we think could happen. So the one about cricket was that extreme heat and air pollution from wildfires had forced cricket indoors. So the story came from the first test match played in the Dome of Cricket in Melbourne. There were lots of points made in the story about what could happen, what the implications were, but the relevant issues and possible future solutions include: it was suggested that test matches would be played across 6 days because there would be more and longer intervals with shorter playing sessions to counter the impact of heat. It was suggested that cricket should be made a winter sport in Australia rather than a summer sport, again, to combat the heat. The pitches don't respond when they're indoors, so the game was being fundamentally changed, and people didn't like that, neither players nor the spectators. And it suggested that cricket was having this massive boost in Scandinavian countries because suddenly the weather was conducive to playing cricket, but far fewer people were playing where it's now really hot in Australia and India. So these imagined scenarios are kind of trying to suppose what might happen in the future should climate change continue. So just a couple of slides with some conclusions from me. Sustainability issues, but climate change in particular, could have, and almost certainly will have, with the current predictions, will have significant impacts on the game of cricket, and not just in terms of what we manufacture, but actually the way the game is played. An extreme heat can have profound effects on player safety in particular. So changes to clothing and equipment can really help to mitigate those impacts. And then solid waste and liquid and gaseous emissions contribute to these current impacts. So we've got to minimize the amount of waste that we produce through proper processes management, and then look at our supply chains. Some of these social issues got to be mitigated through looking at our supply chains as well. A very quick whiz through some of the issues, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about some more later as well. But thanks, back to Chris.
Thank you, Russell. As you're probably all aware, we're running slightly over time, but don't worry, we'll catch it up in either the panel discussions or the breakout rooms. So thanks, Russ. I thought that very much underlined the why part of what I spoke about earlier. Absolutely makes it imperative that we look at how we change now. So next speaker is Mark-Ivar Magnus, who's the Vice President for the World Sporting Goods Federation industry. And he's going to talk about the pledge that he's working on with FIFA around this very subject matter. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Chris. Should I show my own presentation, right?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, so let me just see if I can share my screen. Give me 1 second, please. Can you see my screen actually?
Yeah, we can.
Yes, we're
Okay,
there.
so I just need to go full mode, but there we go. Can you still see it?
It's coming up with a notes bit.
Oh, hang on, that's the wrong one. Yeah, I just did. Apologize for that. Okay, so should work now, right, Chris?
Yeah, perfect.
Perfect. So thank you very much for having me on this call. I just want to give a quick introduction for those who are not familiar with our organization. WFSGI is the World Federation of Sporting Goods Industry. So we are an international body representing the sporting goods industry. This includes brands like the Nike, Adidas, etc., but also manufacturers, mainly based in Asia. Then we have retailers like Intersport, Decathlon, Sport 2000, and the fourth group of members are the regional and national sporting goods federations. So, for example, in Europe, FESI, and then you have a national level as well, for example, in the US, SFIA, etc. So we're representing those companies, and one of the older projects that we have, which is running over 10 years now, is our pledge that we do for the industry. And I think, so looking into the presentations that we've seen so far this morning, we're now going a little bit more into the practical area. And this might be one example how you can look into compliance as an industry and how you can engage in the discussion and on a practical level actually do something. And we had some pre-discussions with Martin, and our opinion is that we can talk about sustainability, especially around environmental, but if you come to the practical level, it goes hand in hand with social aspects as well, especially if you want to audit your supply chain. Social audits might be an easier starting point because no matter what kind of product you're producing, social questions are more or less the same across the industry. Whereas if you look into environmental issues, it really depends on the particular product. Are you using alloy? Are you using certain chemicals, etc.? So the pledge is also looking a little bit more on the social part, but it is applicable, of course, across the board to different aspects. So to explain you a little bit more about our work here, and I'm not sure, Chris and Martin, how you want to handle it, if people have questions, if they should chip in, or if you want to take them at the end.
Probably at
We'll
the end.
take them at the end, I think.
Okay,
perfect. Just because of timings, yeah.
So the credits have to go to FIFA here. It's a rather unknown issue, but this was developed together with FIFA. And looking into the historical background, it all started around the 90s when child labor was an issue, especially in Pakistan and India in the football production. And there were quite some campaigns and media coverage about the issues, and there was reputational damage to the brand, suppliers, retailers involved in the football business. And it was also quite negative impact for FIFA as the world governing body for football. So this was actually the situation that prevailed in the 90s. And based on this problem, the industry, together with some other organization like FIFA, but also the UN, established the Atlanta Agreement. And the Atlanta Agreement was basically an agreement to see how we can sort out the issue of child labor. And so in Pakistan, IMAC was founded. IMAC is the Independent Monitoring Association for Child Labor. And we had in India SGFI, who took more or less kind of the same role to work with the factories to avoid that kids are working there. And based on that agreement, we were looking into how can we practically enroll a program to overcome that issue together with FIFA. And FIFA said we have licenses producing football. So if you want to use a certain quality mark, FIFA inspected, FIFA approved, there are several of them. FIFA wants to make sure that these products are produced without child labor. So we as the industry, we said we're going to pledge for certain of the companies who are our members, who know, etc. And so this was where this strange term comes from, pledge. And this was basically the starting idea. So at the beginning, it was just a paper we signed off for members. And we were just looking at child labor and just at Pakistan and India. And then there was a whole development since then. We said in 2012, this is not of the state of the art any longer, because there was a shift in global football production. Hand-stitch football was no longer the big part of the football sold, so it started with machine stitching. And when the machine stitching came up, China, Thailand, and other countries became active and took a big chunk of the global volume. So we said it's not fair to focus on India and Pakistan, solely on those two countries. And then we also had to recognize that the program had some first successes. And child labor, I mean, you can never say you're waterproof or or it's 100% given that there's no child labor any longer. But there were other issues coming up in the field of sustainability, and so we said we should A, not focus only on those two countries, and we should B, not focus only on child labor. So what we actually did, we took the entire WFSGI Code of Conduct, which is I would say really robust state-of-the-art code of conduct, which is applicable for our members because they have to sign that code off if they join the organization. So it means it's applicable on a global level across the industry. Both brands, but also suppliers and retailers can use it. And our corporate responsibility committee is taking care on an ongoing basis to update that code if there are new developments. So we said we take that code together with FIFA, and we say FIFA licensees have to comply with the entire code. So no longer looking just at child labor, but also working hours, salaries, health and safety, etc. And we have also some environmental aspects. And this was a huge development. And over time, then even though FIFA started with footballs, they saw this as a decent solution, and they also included then artificial turf, goal line technology systems, EPTS, which is the electronic performance tracking systems, those chips that the players have in their shirts. So they include more and more products into that program today. And so that's the idea and the program behind it, and just going down really on the practical level, what it all looks like for a candidate FIFA licensee to go through that program. I will quickly explain you what the procedure looks like, and again you can apply that for whatever you want. So the first thing is we have a guidance manual and agreement that the licensees have to sign, where we really explain what they have to respect, etc. And it's also guidance which explains step by step what they have to do. So we also explain what the purpose is, which parties are involved, how they have to submit papers, the liabilities, governing law, etc. That's the first thing. So it's what they have to read, sign, and give us back so that we're sure they have seen that. And then we have that actual pledge form. And we need there the contact details of the FIFA licensee, but also of the factory where they produce. And if they're working with any trading companies, we want those information as well, so that we really know where the product is coming from. And then there's our code, and they have to sign off this code, that they respect that code. And it has to be signed by the factory and the licensee. And as you remember, I said at the beginning, this was the whole exercise. But what we do now is we also request an audit report on an annual basis. So even if a FIFA license might run over 4 years, there must be an audit report done on an annual basis. So it's not allowed to be older than 1 year, and it has to cover all the provisions that we have in the WFSGI Code of Conduct. We're not requesting FIFA licensees to make an audit report specifically for that program if they're already enrolled in a multi-stakeholder initiative or anything like that. That's the work of our staff, that they actually look to any existing audit reports which fulfills those requirements, which means the audit report is not older than 1 year and it covers our code. Whether this is a SMETA audit, an FLA audit, Fairware Foundation audit, whatever you call them, we will check first if they cover everything, and second, if the factory is compliant with at least the provisions of our code. And the audit has to be conducted by an independent third-party auditing company, so that it is completely independent. And a quite new development, excuse me, is that we say the auditing company has to be an active member of APSCA, which is a newly established global body, an association of professional social compliance auditors, and they have a kind of a threshold standard that companies have to meet. So with that requirement, we ensure that the auditing company is delivering a certain quality, has a certain experience, etc. And then the last point is the audit report has to be owned by the FIFA licensee. So we want to make sure that, let's take a brand, Adidas is applying for the licensee. The audit report has to be owned by Adidas. They're not allowed to take an audit report from Nike or Puma, who is also producing in that factory, and provide that audit report, because we want to create awareness. We want to make sure that they're responsible for that. And in case something is happening, it's of course, from a legal perspective, ridiculous if Adidas would have to rely on an audit from Puma. So this is the last requirement with regard to the audit. And then if they fulfill all of that, and if we went through the audit report and we see that the production is in compliance, there's a certain service fee they have to pay. And then we have a letter of approval that goes to FIFA. And this looks like quite old school, but it's FIFA has developed an online system where we can log on and we can tick boxes, we can do everything online. So it's virtual, it's really quick. And only once we have made that pledge, FIFA will grant the license to the candidate company. So that's the very first step in the whole process for FIFA to accept the company as a licensee. If they don't comply with the code, they won't be a licensee. And also, if the next year there might be some major issues that we can't work on with the licensee, FIFA has the right to cancel the license anytime if the FIFA licensee has not a valid pledge from the WFSGI. So that's a little bit the process from a practical point of view. And it was new to us. We've done that now over a decade, as I explained. We are now rolling out that program for World Rugby and other international sport organizations. And I would say the lessons we learned through that exercise is that it certainly helps to create awareness across a sector. So I would say today, if you look to football manufacturers, they all know what compliance is, what social aspects are, what kind of standards are important, because of that powerful development that was fostered by FIFA, and where we really installed a program which created that awareness in the sector. And what we also have to recognize, what's really important, it's not a one-time exercise, it's a journey. So as I explained to you, we started somewhere really with a simple solution, and we came to quite sophisticated level today with FIFA. But if we look into other sectors, it's maybe too ambitious to start on that level. You have to create awareness first in a sector. You have to make sure, talking to the factories, have they already been audited? Do they know what sustainability issues are? What's the local standard? Is there a certain level of compliance already? And if that's not a given, you might decide that you start on a lower level where you might not have such a high audit frequency, because you first want to go into remediation actions, follow-up audits, and see that corrective measures have been taken. So that's important to know, that the whole story is a journey that you have to go through. And as I said, full compliance is not likely to be achieved from scratch. So if you go and audit the first time factory, you will find non-compliances, and that's something you have to be aware of. But what we also think as an industry, inactivity is no longer an option. I mean, we've seen the presentation before from Russell, etc., and time is ripe to become active, and we also see it as an industry organizations that we have more and more people coming to us addressing such issues, being interested in such developments. We have the Center for Sports and Human Rights that was recently established, where you have many of the sport governing bodies who are active in, which is looking into how you organize events, etc., and having a focus on sustainability. So we see that development going on, and we think so it's time to address it. I was requested to write down a few possible next steps off the top of my head, and I think so it's important to look, if you want to address that as an industry, to exchange with the cricket governing bodies and see what is their interest. Is there a willingness to do something? And then maybe an assessment of the licensing systems that are in place. And is there any opportunity to include also some sustainable aspects, not just liability insurance, quality, etc., but also some sustainable requirements. And then what we think is really important from an industry perspective is that you thoroughly assess what kind of corporate responsibility programs are the licensees already having. Maybe they're already doing something. Maybe they already audit against code. So to understand what's already there, to define where you want to start off and to make sure that you respect the efforts and the resources that companies already put into that topic, into sustainability. And then, of course, you have to define the scope of a program. What do you want to comply with? What are the important aspects? And what we think what is really crucial to make such a system success story is that you thoroughly brief the parties and you make sure that you create that awareness and that you roll out also an agreement and a plan, which says, we've done that with FIFA. They say, well, you have time to look into the issues during half a year. There will be the first audits in 1 year's time, etc. And we want you to fully comply within this time frame. So that's important, and to clearly and transparently communicate that. Yeah, that would be my part so far, if that's okay. I hope it wasn't too long.
No, thanks, Mark. That was absolutely really, really riveting watching, because I think that there is obviously a place for this within cricket, but obviously within wider sport as well. It's yeah, it certainly helps to address those issues that you raised specifically around, you know, how you produce your goods sustainably and, you know, applying the right processes and principles to them. Right, so thank you, Mark. And our next speaker then is Guido Battaglia, who's the Head of Policy and Outreach for the Centre for Sports and Human Rights. Guido, if you're okay, I'm sorry we've been running a bit late, but I gather you've given us a little bit extra of your time, so thank you.
No, thank you very much. I hope that everybody can hear me, and let me just share my presentation. Okay, this is not the right.
Okay, it's
okay, should be working now.
Yeah, perfect.
Good morning, and thank you very much to the organizers for the opportunity to speak today. Also building on the other presentations from other colleagues, addressing social issues is fundamental to advancing the Sustainable Development Goals. Efforts to maximize positive outcomes for people and the planet have to be combined with efforts that contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals in ways that also minimize negative impacts. This is a point I wanted to make at the beginning, and some of the points I will be raising during my presentation also build on, in particular, what Russell and Mark previously presented. So topics I will address today. My brief presentation will focus on 3 aspects. First of all, human rights impacts occurring in sport, and also a specific focus on supply chain impact. Then I would like to share information on the internationally recognized framework that helps all industries address human rights issues in the supply chain. And last, building also on previous comments, I will just briefly share some information on the work we're doing as the Center for Sport and Human Rights, and how this work can help actors in the sporting goods industry and working in with the sport of cricket address some of the issues I will be bringing up. So let's start with human rights impacts occurring in sport. First of all, I would like to share with you an ecosystem map of the world of sport from a human rights perspective. This is an exercise that we are conducting here at the Center for Sport and Human Rights. You see that at the core of the map, there are no institutions, but people. You see athletes, journalists, fans, volunteers, workers, particular migrant workers and other workers involved in supply chain, listed really included at the core of this map. And all of that can benefit from sport. We are all aware of the benefit impacts and the positive impacts that sports like cricket may have on people. But like any other industry, sport may also have negative impacts. And if you look at the outside part of this graph, you will see institutions and organizations that throughout their activities may have impacts on these people. You see, of course, international federations, major event owners, professional sport bodies, event organizers, host governments. Everybody plays a role. Very important for this discussion, clearly, is business. And business can be involved in sport as a sponsor. We can think about broadcasters as well, are directly working with, for example, the sport of cricket as commercial partners. And then, of course, there are suppliers and those who are providing sporting goods, like those that Mark mentioned beforehand. So this is an effort to map the world of sport, to combine why this discussion is relevant and why and where does this cricket and clothing discussion fits with what I'm going to share afterward. So here you can find a list of examples of negative impacts in the world of sport. You can see that athletes, communities, journalists, workers, female athletes, and other affected groups are those who may be victims of human rights abuses in sport. And supply chain issues, like, for example, issues in construction or in the apparel sector, are clearly part of this list. And we have seen issues rising in Qatar and in many other places where major sport events will take place. And this is, of course, something relevant for the International Cricket World Cup or any other cricket-related event. So we can deep dive on specific human rights risks in a complex global supply chain. Human rights and labor abuses may take place in complex global supply chain for sporting goods, merchandise, uniforms, medals, and beyond. Goods and services like clothing, electronics, foods, and construction materials, they're often sourced from suppliers and subcontractors in the lowest cost countries, often in countries where governments are either unable or unwilling, basically, to enforce basic standards, and where abuses in production processes may include, for example, forced labor, illegal child labor, serious health and safety breaches, low or unpaid wages, discrimination, union intimidation, and the denial of freedom of association and collective bargaining. These supply chains can involve several hundred primary relationships and several thousand suppliers beneath their initial tier, spanning a very diverse range of industries. Is it a company's duty or responsibility to fix everything wrong in a country? Understanding companies' responsibility can be very hard without a framework to help them navigate their way. And this is the reason why I wanted to share a couple of words on the internationally recognized standards that may help companies, but also sport organizations, identify their specific responsibilities when it comes to human rights. The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights are the global standard for preventing and addressing the risk of adverse impacts on human rights linked to business activity. And they provide the internationally accepted framework for enhancing standards and practices with regard to business and human rights. So what do these principles say? First of all, they were unanimously approved by the Human Rights Council in 2011. They reference many other standards that are essential for business, like the OECD guidelines on multinational enterprises, the ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, and of course, the International Bill of Human Rights. They played a key role to help advance the discussion from who is responsible for what to how can we implement and how can we take actions to address some of these issues. And they do so basically by identifying 3 key pillars, which define the role of each relevant stakeholder. Pillar 1 is about governments, and is about their duty to protect human rights. Governments have the duty to protect against human rights abuses by third parties, including business, and they have to do so, by, of course, enforcing laws and standards. Then it comes to business and their responsibility to respect human rights, the responsibility to avoid violating human rights wherever and however they operate. And the third pillar, it's about access to effective remedy. And it is about make things right. When someone's rights are impacted, what is the solution and how can this be fixed? And both governments and business play a role there. When it comes to the responsibility for business to respect human rights, it's important to flag that unlike when it comes to the environmental sector where negative impacts can be offset, the problem with human rights is that the commitment should be a commitment to respecting all internationally recognized human rights. And this, of course, increases the responsibility of business and also brings an additional responsibility that goes beyond more common corporate social responsibility perspective, where you may say we can dig a well, we can build a school, and then we're doing our job there. Actually, the job for business that is operating in different areas and different sectors is mainly not to cause, contribute, or be linked to negative human rights. How can companies, in particular sport organizations, basically take action to make sure that they know and they show what it means to respect human rights? First of all, the first step is about commitment. It's about stating in main documents, statutes, that they are committing to respecting all internationally recognized human rights. And it will be needed also to outline in these main documents what are the steps and how you're planning to do that. Second point, assessing risk of adverse human rights impact. And this is about assessing not only the risks to business, which is something that business is used to do, but it is about assessing the potential risks to people and what are the main risks that their activities may be linked to, and also how can they manage to address these risks at stake. As I mentioned beforehand, one company, may directly cause a human rights impact, and it may be an example of a company that discriminates when it comes to wages between men and women. But in many other instances, a company may be involved as a contributor to human rights impact. And one example may be a company that strongly recommends to use security forces in one place or next to one factory that have a negative human rights track. But more often, and this is clearly the case when it comes to supply chain issues, companies may be linked to human rights abuse. This means that abuses may take place at a second or third or fourth level or tier of distance between their activity and the business relationships they have with their with the companies that are directly involved. And this, of course, generates challenges because the further you go in the supply chain, the more difficult it is to identify not only to identify the impacts, but also to identify how you're linked to this and what you can do to minimize these impacts. Of course, once you have mapped the potential impacts you may have, starting in particular with the salient ones, it is important to integrate human rights into policies, procedures, and responsibilities, which means that really you need to have the right systems in place in your governance structure to address these issues. Tracking, very important. You can only measure success of what you only if you have the right information and the data available. And then, of course, communication. You need to be in a position to know and show that you are conscious of the human rights risks at stake, and you have to be transparent, basically, about what is happening, acknowledge gaps, acknowledge issues at stake, and constructively engage with all stakeholders to seek to identify solutions to these issues. Last point, connected with the remedy point that I mentioned beforehand, make it right. When harm happens, where it is clear that there is a connection between your activity and the negative impact, and this will happen. It happens throughout the whole spectrum of industries in this world. Be ready to make sure that you can put action in place to make it right. So it is a complex process. It is indeed very, very difficult to not only to assess responsibilities within the supply chain, but it is also extremely complex to affect change when these impacts happen at a level that is far from your direct activities. This is not a reason for business to disengage. Actually, this is a reason for business to exert its leverage in the best way it can. And efforts, international collective efforts, have proved to be helpful to advance on this topic. We're conscious of many multi-stakeholder initiatives that take place at the pre-competitive level that help the industry advance on this issue. The Center for Sport and Human Rights, when it comes to human rights abuses in the world of sport, is an entity that can help together industry representatives advance on these issues. As I mentioned beforehand, dialogue is key. And the center offers a platform for meaningful stakeholder engagement on these issues by bringing together governments, companies, sponsors, broadcasters, affected groups and their representatives, very important, and also industry associations like the World Federation for the Sporting Goods Industry. We address these issues in the context of mega sporting events, in the context of child rights abuse in sport, in the context of access to remedy. And what we do together is that we develop tools and guides to help sport bodies, local organizing committees, sponsors, and broadcasters understand how to embed human rights into their operations and respond responsibly to crises they may face. We are the platform where inclusive multi-stakeholder discussion can take place. We organize events, podcasts, webinars, and we convene regular working groups to address human rights issues and to identify practical solutions in compliance with internationally recognized human rights standards. If you would like to hear more about our work, I'm looking forward to engaging with you. So this is the end of my presentation. I hope that it was informative. It resonates with the context of cricket and sporting goods. And I would really like to thank you again for the opportunity and for your attention.
Guido, thank you very much. That's clearly you're the moral conscience of sport. And actually, it kind of provides a nice reality check, you know, for the kind of passion that sits behind sport. And, you know, when obviously any of us are in a stadium supporting team, country, whatever it is, we perhaps don't always, or I would say most of the time, don't have that kind of insight into what sits behind it. And certainly compromising human rights shouldn't be part of delivering whatever, you know, element of sport it is. So thank you for that. Are you going to be able to stay for a little while, Guido?
I have a hard stop at past, but I would really love to answer any question or keep contributing
so-
to the discussion.
Brilliant. Okay, so we're going to move to the panel part of the program, which is going to be facilitated by Martin Charter. So Guido, you'll have a replacement. Neil McPhee will step in when you leave. So if it'll be Russell Seymour, Mark Ivar, Guido, and Andrew Martin, who is the Vice President for the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, will be on the panel, and we'll fire questions. We'll take some out of the chat. There's been some really good conversation in the chat, and so we can probably pick up some of those questions there. Over to you, Martin.
Okay, thanks, Chris, and thank all the speakers. And I think for the chat, for the questions, short, precise questions are great. We can sort of pick up there. So, you know, in summary, in this event, you know, we're looking, you know, at primarily the issues around the equipment, the clothing and apparel, but clearly that big context, the big issues, you know, that Russ has brought out, you know, clearly have a direct relationship. And what I got out of the conversation was that this area, in terms of the equipment, etc., has not been really looked at in great detail, particularly the social dimension. I think Russ's presentation really brought in that much bigger perspective in terms of climate change and the fact it's now here, the Joe route example, but also that link to the health dimension is very clear within the social context. I think Mike Ivor then brought in that broader experience over sort of nearly 10 years of FIFA working at the football in the football sector, and some of the issues that manufacturers now are tackling in their supply chains. And then Guido really focused in some of those more specific issues around human social and human rights side. I personally see us in a fifth green consumer wave now, where we're starting to see, you know, issues morphing and changing, and more questions emerging. Some of it's coming full circle. I'd say, you know, the first wave was the 60s. Second wave was the late 80s, around the time of with Russ's point there of the you know, the Brundtland Commission in 1987, you know, Mrs. Thatcher finding the hole in the ozone layer, the Green Consumer Guide, and then just after that, the first Earth Summit in 92. So that was a sort of second big wave. The third wave, in my opinion, was in the 2000s, when climate change got a lot more visibility. You know, there's a lot of questions around what is your personal carbon footprint. A lot of companies really focusing overtly on low carbon energy efficiency. But I perhaps saw prior to the lockdown this emergence of a new wave driven by youth, and that was different. So youth around climate change particularly, and the power of youth to use social media to you know, spread the message. And I think during the pandemic that sort of morphed further, in my opinion, where the human health dimensions come into it, and biodiversity and nature. So I think the social element and the nature element, you know, which chimes very closely with a lot of some of the conversations. So I'd like to just start off by, you know, asking the panelists, and I'll start with Guido because Guido's on a time, you know, constraint, is from what you've heard today, and I appreciate you're not a cricket is a new game for you, but what would you say from what you've heard today and your own thoughts? What would you say you would perceive to be maybe the biggest challenge that maybe the sector will face, and maybe any opportunities that you might think?
Thank you, Martin. Also, we heard from Mark and this presentation connected with the FIFA experience. My first reaction to your question, Martin, is that supply chain issues are common, not only to sports, but also to many industries. So I believe that there are opportunities to adopt similar approach, or the example that Mark shared beforehand is something that can be, of course, applied to the context of cricket. When it comes to cricket, also there are also geopolitical perhaps considerations that are relevant. But I would say that when it comes to human rights, I see a common pattern for all sports, you know, to follow the UNGPs and to collaborate with the parallel sector, you know, to advance on these issues. I think that also because of the popularity of cricket in certain areas of the world, clearly some aspects may be more relevant than others, but this is also linked to the need to conduct human rights due diligence and to really understand the major risks at stake. And this can be done through stakeholder engagement with affected groups. And this would be an exercise that can provide more insights on where should we start from when it comes to cricket.
And just a quick follow-up on that is bearing in mind a lot of the supply chain, it appears, is in South and Southeast Asia. You know, there goes back to Russell's point in terms of sustainable development definition. It needs, you know, the issues may well be slightly different in different countries as such. So do you have examples, or any example one, which is great, of you know, maybe a Western company, you know, working with, you know, other stakeholder groups in say India or Pakistan, you know, and any example there in any sort of issues, or what would you see with that sort of perspective?
Yes. There is one effort that is conducted on a yearly basis, which is called the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, and I'm happy to share the link with you, which is an effort conducted by the World Benchmarking Alliance that is benchmarking the efforts conducted by various industry sectors when it comes to human rights and their commitments. Many companies that are also very active in that area of the region are ranked and benchmarked against this human rights criteria, and we can see that companies like Adidas or others performed pretty well, although clearly there is margin for improvement for everyone. I am happy to share with you the link to this corporate human rights benchmark, Martin. That
would be great, and we tried to invite some of the larger transnational players to the workshops. We didn't try, we did, but perhaps they're awaiting the outcome of the workshop to engage, hopefully, in the future. So, and again, just to reinforce what Chris said at the beginning, we'll produce a short briefing document after this event that we'll be happy to share. So maybe I'll go now to Russ. Similar sort of question, you know, from, you know, someone who's been involved around the issues for a long time, you know, from various perspectives. What would you see, thinking about that equipment side, you know, one or two of the biggest challenges, and maybe some of the opportunities that you might see emerging as we go forward?
Yeah, thanks, Martin. I think the biggest issues we need to address are the issues that are happening now in terms of production. And there's an old adage or whatever, an old phrase around when is the best time to plant a tree. Obviously, trees are relevant to what we're talking about in terms of bats, but this is, you know, in terms of a general principle, when's the best time to plant a tree? It was 30 years ago. So that's when we should have been taking action. The second best time to plant a tree is now. So we've got impacts happening across the board. You know, sports apparel, sports clothing, sports equipment is a microcosm of all of the other manufacturing that is going on. So, you know, we're not alone in terms of starting to think about these issues. It's just that maybe arguably we've got a good platform in terms of sport to actually start saying why we're talking about these issues, what the benefits will be moving forward, and spread those a bit more generally. I think the heat issue that I talked about a reasonable amount, is probably the one that's closest to individual players in terms of individual player safety. It's the one where we seem to be having this increasing trend in higher heat. Even in England, we're getting these hotter days where not just players but fans are being impacted. So that's a very direct impact. I think the other issues around climate change tend to affect cricket and other sports in less direct ways. In terms of flooding, storm damage, those kind of things, it affects the infrastructure rather than what we're specifically talking about in terms of clothing and apparel. So I think it's engaging with current manufacturing and what we're doing and trying to make sure that our supply chains, from both the social perspective that we've heard very well from Guido, but from an environmental perspective, are actually functioning much better. And then that is going to need engagement with ICC, with national governing bodies as well, around the playing regulations, and maybe looking at the standards, reviewing some of the British standards. I know British standards do have a strong desire to include sustainability across all of their standards. So is there a way of inserting this in there somehow? So yeah, it's all about engagement, what we're doing now. But I think moving forward, linking the issues to player safety is probably the surest way of making change. But there are other issues that need to come in there as well.
So there's something there about action, engagement, and linking it to the sort of real issues that players deal with, because they're operating in the environment per se. So that's great. And I know there is a number of questions emerging. I see Daryl, and there was some other questions, but we'll just pick up with the panelists first, and then we'll pick up those other questions. So you're not forgotten. So maybe Mark Ivor, the same sort of point from what you've heard today, again as a newbie to cricket, but involved in a lot of different sectors where I'm sure you're seeing parallel issues. What are some of your observations on the sort of challenge and any opportunities? Muted.
Yeah. Thank you, Martin. I think so. It's important coming from the industry. I'm not sure who the audience is, but if we have brands on the call, if we have manufacturers on the call, it's all nice to hear that there's time for action, etc. But the question is always, how do you translate that into practical action? How can you be a game changer? And it's quite important because this is not part of most of those kind of discussions. How can you become active as a company? And it's just a call out to all the companies, if you can work together. Most of those topics are of non-competitive nature. If you share suppliers, you won't be able to change anything if you're not doing that with the other brands who are using that supplier as well. It makes no sense if the supplier is just applying certain standards just for the part he is producing for you. That's not practically implementable. You have to change everything. And so it's really important to work together, even though you're not doing that normally as competitors. This is not a non-competitive area. You will save resources, also money if you do that together, and the chances of success are much larger if you move ahead as an industry, as a group. If you take on board manufacturers and you say, hey, this is a topic we have to tackle together, we're sitting all in the same boat. So seeing SAC on the call, they are working together with that apparel industry, where you have competitors like H&M, Zara, but Nike, Adidas, etc., who are joining to take up such discussions. And I think so that's important as well for the cricket industry. Now, we are aware that if it comes to hard goods like the bats, etc., there are no such organizations. We have set up the Responsible Sport Initiative for the bike industry, where they're jointly auditing their supply chain. So this is something we're happy to share as well. But it's really from a practical point of view, break those barriers and try to sit together and see that you get that neutral platform to discuss such issues, and the chances of success are much broader. And that's just something, a giveaway if people are going back then and say, okay, where should we start? What should we do? So maybe just use such calls, such opportunities to see who is also interested to move ahead.